Hi, everybody. I am in Aspen, Colorado, and I watched the debate with a group of people. I've been talking to a lot of friends, and I thought it might be interesting to talk to my friend Brian Goldsmith and to hear the questions that you all might have. Brian Goldsmith is a Democratic political consultant. We used to work together. Hi, everyone. I think a lot of people are really surprised and disappointed at President Biden's performance at the debate tonight in Atlanta. There were many lies told by Donald Trump, a whole assortment, and apparently the moderators wanted to leave it up to President Biden to correct some of these untruths, particularly late term abortion, false information that Donald Trump was giving. So, anyway, this is going to be a very interesting few weeks to see what will happen, how the Democratic Party is going to respond to this performance. Vice President Harris was just on CNN basically defending President Biden and saying his performance in office matters more than his performance in this debate. Anyway, Brian's been talking to a lot of people in the Democratic Party, so I thought it would be interesting to hear what some of those folks have been saying. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Katie. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for hopping on this Instagram Live. We've got a lot of people listening tonight, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, Brian, is you are very plugged in to Democratic politics, and I've been listening to some of the analysis on cable news. I've heard people say Democrats are in a state of panic. I've heard other people. Well, that's pretty much what I'm hearing, Brian. I don't think there's an alternative reaction to that. And I'm curious what people are telling you. But maybe we should start from the beginning. Watching this debate tonight, what was your assessment of both candidates' performances?
Painful. That's the one word I would use to describe both performances for very different reasons. Painful on the Trump side for all the obvious reasons. He, lied like I breathe, distorted and misinterpreted both his record and willfully distorted Biden's record. That wasn't really news, though. He does that every day. What was painful on our side, by our, I mean my fellow Democrats, is the president's performance reinforced precisely the doubts that everyone has. That's always the biggest problem you could have in politics, is when you do or say something that goes right to the heart of the issue, the liability that is holding you back. And that is what happened tonight. I mean, remember the context here. The president agreed to this historically early debate. There has never before been a general election debate before the conventions in the summer. Why did Biden agree to do that? Because he needed to change the dynamic of the race, because he has been behind for months and months and months. And he needed to communicate to people a bunch of things, but more than anything else, that he is up for this, that their doubts that he's too old are wrong. And if anything tonight, he reinforced those doubts.
I'm curious, as I mentioned, Donald Trump said a lot of false things. The moderators did not correct some of these falsehoods. I think they formatted it so President Biden could correct the record in a rebuttal period. What did you think about that? All the analyses I've been reading are basically that Trump gave Biden plenty of ammunition, but Biden was not up to the task of calling him out on his mistakes because he was having so much trouble kind of expressing himself.
He didn't have the tools to do it. That is, by the way, a different thing than saying he doesn't have the tools to be president. I mean, the reason this is so difficult for so many people like me is that this is a good man who has been a very good president, by my definition. He has done the thing that a lot of people dismissed or said was impossible. He's built bipartisan compromises across a range of really, big issues and gotten a ton done. He's united the world to stand up for Ukraine. He has been a very good president. He has the capacity to be president. But does he have the capacity to beat Donald Trump, who is, from my perspective, the biggest threat to American democracy since the Civil War?
Well, Brian, I have to ask you, isn't perhaps the most important role of the president to be a communicator, to basically tell the American people, to inspire them, to inform them, to explain to them what he's doing and what some of the problems are? If a president or, the leader of the free world cannot communicate clearly and cogently, isn't that cause for concern in and of itself?
Yes, that is a critical part of the job, and he ought to be able to do that. And it's very disappointing that he couldn't tonight. Now, he did during the State of the Union. He has at other times and other situations, but this was very concerning because people are not just making a judgment about the president now, they're making a judgment about the president in 2028 until January 20th of 2029. And there is widespread concern in the party.
Well, tell me what some of the people you've talked to, I'm sure you've talked to a lot of people. I'm sure your text messages were blowing up tonight. What were some of the people you respect in the party? And you don't have to name names unless you think it's okay to, but what were you hearing from people in the party who are giving advice? Because, one point made tonight is a lot of people were worried about, if you hear about the coattails effect, what's the opposite of riding on someone's coattails? I mean, that this performance and perhaps President Biden's election success or lack thereof would hurt down ballot candidates significantly.
Well, I mean, we're already seeing that in a number of the battleground state polls. You have Democratic senators who are running well ahead of President Biden in a number of key states. One I know well, Senator Jackie Rosen in Nevada has been consistently a few points ahead of her Republican opponent, and that has been among the weakest states of the battlegrounds for President Biden. So that was true before tonight. I can't imagine that won't be more true after tonight. Sometimes the voters surprise you. I do think we need to let the voters digest this for a day or two and see the judgment that they reach. But we know one thing for sure, which is their concerns about his age were not diminished tonight. If anything, they were enhanced.
Our friend Frank Luntz was with some undecided voters who were, according to his tweets, I didn't talk to him, pretty concerned and disappointed, not by his policy positions, but by his performance. And this is really theatrics. I mean, it's also substance, but so much of a debate is, how you carry yourself, how you express yourself, how you're able to correct your opponent. And performance wise, he just simply wasn't up to the task. I know that you told me on a text that he wasn't feeling well, that he had a cold, and his voice was quite weak from the get-go, right? It sounded extremely hoarse. You kind of wanted to go, right, for him. As you were watching, you were just like, clear your throat.
Clear your damn throat. Take a sip of water. Yeah.
But is that true that he was not well or not feeling well?
Well, I don't know, but the White House put out to a couple of reporters that he has a cold. What was that great Gay Talese magazine article? Frank Sinatra has a cold. This is
only you would remember that, Brian.
Well, like threatened a big Madison Square Garden concert. I mean, this is that times 10 billion in terms of its significance. I think when Vice President Harris went out on CNN and tried to defend this, she basically said, look, there's the performance of 90 minutes in a debate, and there's the performance of 3.5 years in the Oval Office, and one is clearly more important than the other. She also said, it was a slow start, but a strong finish.
But it
You
wasn't a
know,
very strong finish.
no, it wasn't a very strong finish. I mean, she's doing the best she can do. Um, Anderson pushed her on, is the guy we saw tonight the guy that you've seen in
And
the
that you
Oval Office?
debated 4 years ago.
Right. And she didn't really answer that question.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, listen, I think the big question, everybody watching, if I know my followers, and then I'm going to look at some of the questions they're asking. Uh, you some people said they expected more from the moderators when it came to fact checking. I don't think the format necessarily lent itself for fact checking, though. Do you, Brian?
I think it's hard. I was actually thinking about this, Katie. Uh, if you were working on this, and if I were helping you, how much would you have jumped in to correct the record, and how much would you have, made it the responsibility of the opposing candidate to do that? And it's a balancing act. I mean, I think maybe you do it a couple of times if there's just
Well, the late
a
term
bald-faced lie.
abortion thing was particularly egregious.
That was one of the
And,
examples
and
I thought of, and the January 6th,
Nancy Pelosi's fault that she didn't
right,
call the. I Googled
total
that. I
BS.
didn't know what he was talking about. Do you?
That's a lie he's promoted for a long time, that, he's done everything possible to,
Well,
that he
no, and
ought.
he said there was a release of some videotape with his, with Nancy Pelosi's daughter, who we know, who's a documentary filmmaker who did do a documentary on January 6th. Anyway, I Googled it. I couldn't really find what he was talking about.
Yeah, I haven't seen that video. I mean, I think we can talk to Liz Cheney about this. I don't think there's anything there. I think he's made up all sorts of stories to deflect from the facts of January 6th and what he did. And what he did is he let it happen for over 3 hours as everybody was begging him to put out a tweet to call off,
Yes, and I thought that President Biden came back with that when he said, this stuff about the National Guard. He said, you didn't do anything for 3 hours. I thought that was a strong rebuttal by President Biden, certainly in comparison to some of the other exchanges that he made. All right, let me ask you something. This, of course, is the big question that people want to know. Like, is the Democratic Party going to try to change the ticket? How problematic is that? Who are some of the names that people who is out there? Could you even do it when the convention is 6 weeks away? Or haven't the delegates already committed? Talk about the likelihood of perhaps Joe Biden either stepping down or someone telling him he needs to step down, and the likelihood of someone replacing him on the ticket. And would that automatically be Kamala Harris, who has a lower approval rating than Joe Biden?
Well, you asked me like 11 questions
I'm
there.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
I know the general gestalt of what you were asking.
Thank you.
So I'll
There
try
are
to deal
actually
with that.
only three, Brian. Three questions I asked you. No,
I don't know.
no.
I don't know. We're going to consult the
Okay, all
transcript
right.
later.
Maybe four.
Okay,
Anyway,
all right,
give it a
all
shot.
right. All right, so is it likely? It's not likely, but it's more likely now than it was before the debate. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible, but Biden would have to choose to step down. There's no grand poobah of the Democratic Party. There's no, people who don't understand politics talk about, oh, well, can the DNC? The DNC is the president. The sitting president of the United States controls his political party. He is the nominee of the party. We ran through a bunch of primaries. He won all of them. The delegates are pledged on the first ballot at the convention to vote for Joe Biden. And indeed, they're probably going to vote for Joe Biden and make him the official nominee before the convention in August, because I think Ohio has some funny law that says that, unless you're officially the nominee before August, whatever, we're not putting you on the ballot. So what would have to happen, and relatively soon, like before that Ohio deadline, which I think is the second week of August, is Biden would have to step down. We could talk about that. And then you would have, I believe, and I'm not a delegate allocation expert, but I think this is how it would work. You would have an open first ballot where the pledged delegates, that is nearly 4,000 people who are party activists and elected officials and volunteers and others, on the convention floor, all of whom are pledged to vote for Joe Biden, no longer vote for Joe Biden because he is no longer a candidate. And so you would have other candidates running, making the case to these elected delegates that they should vote for, Whitmer or Warnock or Kelly or Buttigieg over the others. Then, if nobody secures a majority of the pledged delegates on the first ballot, you have a second ballot. And on the second ballot, the so-called superdelegates are allowed to vote. Superdelegates are governors, mayors, senators, elected officials who are delegates by virtue of their position in the party as leaders, as elected leaders, former DNC chairs, lots of others. So that is the so-called party establishment. They don't have a voice in this really, not formally, until the second ballot. And then you go through ballot after ballot after ballot with both the pledged delegates and the unpledged or super delegates voting until one man or woman receives a majority of the votes and becomes the nominee. Now, the last time this happened was 1968. 1968 was the last year of the old system when it wasn't really primaries and caucuses that picked the nominee. It was delegates on the floor of the convention. And so Hubert Humphrey, who was then the vice president of the United States, after Lyndon Johnson, who was the sitting president, dropped out, as you know, Katie, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy both ran for the nomination in primaries. Kennedy was killed. McCarthy was still running. Humphrey did not enter a single primary or caucus, and he became the nominee of the Democratic Party on the first ballot because he secured a majority of the delegates. Now, 68 was a particularly disastrous convention for the Democratic Party because it was split over the war in Vietnam. That said, Humphrey almost won the general election. People kind of forget that. Mm-hmm. And so that's the sort of scenario, as I've kind of walked you down, history lane there, of what we could be looking at. And it's that kind of chaos, division.
I was going to say,
yeah,
it sounds like a shit show, something I can say on an Instagram live, that there would be all these people and it would be actually decided at the convention itself. It's not, is there any scenario where President Biden could step down and there could be somebody, I guess, anointed or someone?
Yeah, he could endorse. I mean, so that's the other scenario. And I think that's a very smart observation, which is he could kind of pre-cook it. That is to say, if Biden endorsed somebody and Barack Obama endorsed somebody and Nancy Pelosi endorsed somebody, that would carry obviously just enormous weight, particularly among Biden delegates. Let's not forget who these people are. They are Joe Biden delegates. So I think they will assign great weight to what he recommends. So yeah, that's one way you could avoid that chaos is the president anointing somebody and hoping that person wins on the first ballot.
And what about Kamala Harris, Brian? I mean, does she have any sort of priority as vice president, the number 2 person on the ticket, to be the heir apparent if a change is made, or is that just not necessarily?
I mean, not for any technical reason. I mean, she would be an obvious candidate and a strong candidate, but it wouldn't be, automatic or, as a result of the rules that she would get the nomination. I think the question this time in the hypothetical that we're discussing would be the same as the question was 4 years ago, which is who can beat Donald Trump? That's why Biden was nominated 4 years ago, because Democrats believed he was the strongest candidate to beat Donald Trump. He didn't check every ideological box. He didn't pass every litmus test. He's not diverse, he's not cool, but Democrats believed he could beat Donald Trump, and that was the priority. That is how Democratic voters think about this election today. So I think everybody would be viewed through that prism.
You said that Kamala Harris would be a strong candidate, and yet her approval ratings, as I mentioned, are lower than Joe Biden's. Now, she does better with Blacks and Hispanic voters, and she's obviously been galvanized by reproductive rights and what's happening vis-a-vis abortion. But given her low approval ratings, why do you say would be a strong candidate?
Well, she's the sitting vice president of the United States. She's the first Black vice president. She's the first woman vice president. She's going to have a big constituency. And remember, these are Biden delegates, and she is part of the Biden-Harris administration. That said, is she the answer to the question that I mentioned a second ago of who can beat Donald Trump?
Donald Trump?
Right. She's probably not the answer to that question. So I think certainly she would not intimidate anyone else from running.
You know, I'm here at the Aspen Ideas Festival. I did a panel on leadership, and you and I have talked about leaders of the future. And I had even wanted to do a series because there are people out there, and maybe I still will, but nobody really hears from them very much. And I think everyone has kept quiet when President Biden decided he wanted to run for re-election. Everybody got in line. But a lot of these people are known more locally or at the state level, but not necessarily national figures. Would they have time to actually raise their profile enough that they could convince voters to vote for them between now and November?
I think there'd have to be a process, and the party would have to lay out a process, which would be probably a series of debates. You start going down this road and you just think about how chaotic and potentially divisive it would be. But, and then you ask yourself, well, compared to what? So yeah, I think people would get known very fast because there would be these debates. I think they'd be very widely watched. Candidacies would be declared, and people would raise a bunch of money and run ads and go on TV shows and Instagram lives and be all over the place. And it would, I guess the upside scenario is you have this sort of, moribund kind of a boring thing happening on the Republican side. The one exciting bit is that Trump is not named his running mate. That's the one thing he can do between now and the convention that will break through and kind of make a little news. But I guess the upside scenario for us, for my party, is, you could have a very exciting primary contest. And if you go back to 2008, which we covered together, Katie, there was all this commentary about how the Clinton-Obama primary contest, which went all the way till June, was going to be very divisive for the party. And you remember there were those pumas at the convention. But of course, in the end, everybody united because fundamentally they agreed on far more than they disagreed. And I think that would happen this time. There's nothing, the glue holding the Democratic Party together is Donald Trump. There's not a single, there's nobody in the Biden coalition from AOC to Liz Cheney who wants Donald Trump to win again. And so, those people will get behind whoever is the ultimate nominee.
And before we go, and I'll let you go, and I'm tired too, Brian, but can you name some people who you think might be potentially under consideration? I've interviewed this week in Aspen, Mitch Landrieu. I interviewed Gretchen Whitmer today, the governor of Michigan. She mentioned a number. I've asked her about Democratic leaders who impressed her. She named a number of female governors. And she also talked about Gina. I always say her name wrong.
Raimondo.
Thank you, Raimondo, who's the Secretary of Commerce, and mentioned a number of other people. So I'm curious, like when you think of names, like who could, in this hypothetical situation, because who knows what's going to happen, but who could possibly fill those shoes? Can you just name some people that your colleagues kind of talk about?
You know, it's going to sound like I'm avoiding or evading your question. I'm really not, and I'm happy to start listing names. But just as sort of context, I don't think anybody among Democrats believes that we don't have a really big bench. There are tons of stars in the Democratic Party.
Oh,
And
Wes Moore was
oh,
also the
yeah.
governor of Maryland,
I mean,
was here in Aspen as well.
yeah, it's a very long list. And the only reason I'm really hesitating is, you know, as we saw this year, or rather, I guess the end of last year with Ron DeSantis, there's just a huge difference between a theoretical candidate for president and an actual candidate for president. You don't really know how people perform until they run, because, you know, what was that great line from Samantha in Sex and the City? Your favorite philosopher. Um, good on paper, bad in bed. I think a lot of presidential candidates are good on paper and bad in bed. And by bed, I don't, you know.
I'm like, what just happened to you?
I don't know. I'm getting punchy. What can I say? Um, there's a huge list of credible, impressive, qualified candidates, but you don't really know who's going to perform well until they're running.